This is a short clip for YouTube. If you want to see the entirety of this conversation, head to my other platforms. The links are in the description. So, Ed, as the creator and somebody who is running an alternative platform to YouTube or Patreon, trying to combine creators being able to find funding and then also produce their content without censorship. One of the issues is how are these people paid, right? And so we've been seeing more and more that Patreon and PayPal are canceling people's accounts. Like, this is an article that came out July 22nd or 26th. PayPal to research transactions that fund hate groups and extremists. If you look through it, like just on first read, it would be easy for, I'm sure, a lot of people to say, well, of course, who wants any number of these terrible things? But as we've seen with YouTube and other sites, what is hate speech? What is extremist content? I mean, these are things that people disagree on. There's not necessarily a consensus, and as people often say, like one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. Depends on what side you're on, and so, like, when it comes to the ideological battlefield, I guess it's a very murky space to be in. And so, like I said, I have journalist friends who are like, I mean, there's hate speech out there. And you're like, okay, but how do you define that? And then, you really want PayPal being in charge of someone being able to fund their actual work. Like, I had Ryan Christian on with The Last American Vagabond. His PayPal was canceled. And, he wasn't even using it himself. Like, there was no transaction happening other than people just sending him money. So they're saying he was using it against their terms of service, but he wasn't even actually using it. I mean, I guess in a sense, people are sending to him, but it's not like he's funneling extremist money or something to fund some kind of activity somewhere that's illegal. So how do you guys work with this? And I'm just curious, before you even talk about how you do it on Utreon, what are your thoughts on this topic, generally speaking, of what the future is for people to do this kind of work and get paid?
Yeah, so Section 230 is something that's been applying to platforms that are publishing content, but the original intent is they don't have to worry about editorializing. They're just a platform. So we've all been thinking about this stuff. I'm sure people have heard about 230 and that concept, but there really has to be some equivalent of 230 for the financial infrastructure, and really infrastructure in general. That's sort of the purpose of provisions like 230. The goal is, the phone company is not going to decide who gets to use the phone, type thing. And really, in terms of the financial space, the fact that these companies are seeing it as their mission to decide who's going to use their financial infrastructure, that's obviously a problem. It's not a problem in theory for the things that most people would agree are no good, but that's not what we're talking about, and that's not what the potential problem is. Of course, once they've built for themselves the ability to decide what gets, what can even participate in the financial system, that's where the problem is, obviously.
Well, and real fast, like, just so people have kind of an idea, Whitney Webb was suspended, or maybe she was permanently canceled. I remember the suspension. I don't know where that stands now, but that from Patreon for something she wrote on her own website, which they said was medical misinformation about COVID. And it's just interesting because, like I said, I mean, it's not the idea of this being someone who's like plotting some kind of terrorist attack, because it's like hate group and extremists that makes you think that these people are going to be like actually physically violent in the world. They must be stopped. You're funding this terrible activity. Her stuff is typically very well researched, and yeah, it's controversial stuff, but she shares her research and her sources and that kind of thing. And it had nothing to do with like being a hate monger, terrorist activity, kind of person. She was giving an alternative viewpoint to COVID, and that was enough for Patreon to say that you're basically going to make people not get the vaccination. So that's how sensitive it is now. And she was saying that, like, if she hadn't been on ROKFIN, it would be very difficult for her to have continued, and so just more and more seems like the line is moving closer and closer to, not being something that's like, this is illegal activity, but just, this is, we're thought police now. Your thinking is too dangerous for us.
Yeah, and that's why this really has to be solved at the level of legislation, because for the companies, if we go from the financial back to the publishing, for the companies that are protected by Section 230, because they have the ability to editorialize and effectively, not technically censor, because that's the government, but effectively they're censoring, practically speaking. Because they have the ability to, they're sort of expected to, from the perspective of perhaps investors, from the perspective of perhaps the people that are just around. If these platforms are all being run effectively from one state in the country, and that state is maybe like plus 40 Democrat, it's not surprising that culturally they just have all these norms, and that they're sort of, they have pressure even from their employees to enforce those norms on their own platform, and that's the problem. So the solution is to end the having your cake and eating it too of Section 230. Section 230 should afford you freedom from the liability related to all this content. But the other part of that, that deal has to be that you're not, usurping the role of the government and deciding, what is allowed to be said. Not that the government's even allowed to do that, but really proactively trying to act as these government agencies. So that's something that has to happen there. And again, something has to be done on the financial side, because you effectively have the same problem, and it goes to all internet infrastructure. It goes to domain names. It goes to web hosting. We saw that with another one of these companies, Parler. They were pulled down from Amazon. Right. So in terms of what we've been doing from the start, we've been taking the approach that we're not full 100% free speech, because we do need to operate in the financial system. We just think there's a much more reasonable position than what Google and YouTube and all these and Facebook and all these other companies have been doing. But we have been smartly and strategically making it so we're not exposed to that kind of risk. So for example, right now we have credit card processing for subscriptions, and we're going to have it for live streaming with Ultra Chats, which are equivalent to Super Chats. And all of that is just going to be with credit card transactions. We're not using services like Stripe or PayPal, because we regard those as being a business risk. So while these alternatives, these competing alternatives, are effectively flying under the radar, nothing too much is happening. But we just see those as tremendous business risks, because those systems, they're all based in the same places as the platforms that people are fleeing, like YouTube. They all have the exact same pressures, and once these companies are not flying under the radar anymore, they can expect those accounts to be taken down. So from our perspective, we've just been extremely careful in terms of creating something that's actually going to be able to last, and again, like, win out in this marathon.
Yeah, and as Utreon being a site that is popular with Second Amendment and firearms creators, I would assume that it would be even more so important to discuss that side of things, because it seems like that would be a topic that could very easily be shut down by a PayPal, for instance, for like, well, these people, they're violent. They're violent people. They're talking about guns. It wouldn't seem like too far of a stretch to see how you could see that those companies making that argument.
Yeah, and I mean, these are, to some extent, companies like PayPal, they're dealing with, hyper growth, hyper scale. They've become so large so quickly that it kind of makes sense that they're trying to deal with everything using AI. But the problem is, there's obviously the inherent problems with using AI. It's not perfect. It works maybe, let's say, 97% of the time, but the times it fails kind of incredibly. One example I like to use with AI is there's a group that was building this neural model, this AI model to detect cows, and so they were training it on an image set of cows. And so they were using it, and it was working fine, and they were publishing papers about it. And suddenly it wasn't working, and it just wasn't working anymore. And it was saying, fields of grass were basically cows. And so they start actually looking, what's going on in this actual AI model, and looking under the hood. And that's the thing with AI, that you don't really know what it's actually doing. You're just pointing it in a direction, and as it's improving and giving you better results, you say, okay, well, this is good. Let's promote this direction. Well, it turns out their AI was not detecting cows. It was detecting green grass and blue skies. So you have these companies that are dealing with hyper growth and hyper scale, and they're using these tools, and these tools are extremely imperfect. They don't even really understand how they work very well. And after that, you have a level of manual review that they use. So they're really they're dealing with real problems in terms of the way they moderate content and deal with hypergrowth.
So have there been any, I guess, sticking points in trying to avoid? I mean, how difficult is it to create a platform like Utreon, where, again, like, the idea is content creators that are censored on YouTube or other sites can come over to Utreon and monetize and try to, grow their audience and make it a full-time job, but we're in this world where there are things like PayPal and Stripe or whatever that you are concerned about. Is how difficult was it to get to where you are, where you're not using that? Is it not that hard? Is it harder than a lot of us think to try to escape this, the circus of financial? And I honestly get nervous about credit cards. Like long term, I do wonder sometimes about banking, just like the big banks and whether they'll eventually, get into the world of saying, we don't really want to bank with you. There have been allegations of that in the past. I don't, they always say, no, we don't do that, but it just, it seems a little fishy. So I don't know. I mean, would I put it past them? No, absolutely not.
Yeah, it's, I'm not too worried yet about the banks and Visa and actual credit card companies themselves yet. They haven't been engaging in too much of this. So I'm not worried about that yet. Some of the ideas of, okay, well, let's decentralize money. I mean, good idea, interesting idea. But the problem is, and what we're finding is that the government pretty quickly, starts regulating that. And unless you're willing to, live, off the grid, or I don't know what, how you want to call it, unless you're willing to do that, then, really you're just kind of getting back to where you started. So these are problems that do have to be dealt with through legislation and ensuring equal access to the financial system. In terms of difficulty of setting this stuff up, so Sean, our COO, he has really great relationships that he's built over a decade with banks, and so we're not worried on that front. We have been careful in terms of third-party services, like especially these huge VC-run services or backed services like Stripe or PayPal. The way we look at it is, it'll make sense to start talking to them at some level of scale where they would regard us as an important account with which it's worth discussing and negotiating. But these smaller companies and all of these alternative platforms are very small companies from the point of view of Stripe or PayPal. These are situations where they're not even going to think twice. They're just going to flip the switch, and they don't care about reasons. So we see that as a strategic business risk, and we think we're pretty intelligently building around that.
If you like wine or coffee or both, here are two of my sponsors that help you support my work and have something great to drink while you watch my videos. The first is AllisonWinePromo.com, Allison with 1L winepromo.com. You get 50% off some of my favorite Argentinian Malbecs and 50% off shipping. One of these bottles comes from the third highest vineyard in the world. They use no flavoring or dyes, no filtering, and no excess chemicals. But if coffee is more your beat, then check out twinenginecoffee.com/Allison, twinenginecoffee.com/Allison. These are all Nicaraguan coffees. They keep many of the jobs local because they grow, select, roast, and package in Nicaragua. They are USDA certified organic, shade grown, and high altitude. So again, twinenginecoffee.com/Allison, AllisonWinePromo.com. Have a great glass of coffee, a great glass of wine, and support free speech, whatever you're drinking.